The wind came down from the Carvorn Mountains like it had a personal grudge against the world. It tore across the Black Wind Valley in freezing gusts, carrying sand and thin needles of ice that stung my face. I pulled my old wool cloak tighter around my shoulders and kept walking along the northern fence line, my boots sinking into the half-frozen mud. I was 31 years old, alone and the owner of what could barely be called a farm at the very edge of the valley. The place had seen better days long before the plague took my parents and left me with nothing but debts, a rotting wooden house, a handful of scrawny goats, one old horse that moved like it was already half dead, and a patchy field of barley that fought the soil more than it grew in it. The fence that surrounded my land was little more than a collection of crooked posts and broken rails, more suggestion than barrier. I was out checking it because the storm threatened to tear the last decent sections down, and if the goats got loose, I'd have nothing left to sell come spring. The wind howled louder, whipping my hair into my eyes. That was when I heard it, a small, broken sound beneath the roar. At first I thought it was an animal caught in one of the old snares, but then it came again, weaker this time, a moan of pure pain. I followed the fence line north, my heart beating faster than it should. The sound grew clearer. Human, or close enough. I rounded a cluster of gnarled bushes and stopped dead. There, tied to one of the sturdiest posts in the entire pathetic fence, was a girl. Not just any girl, an orc. She was young, no more than 20 if I had to guess. Her green skin had gone ashen from the cold. Long black hair matted with mud and frost hung over her face. Her arms were pulled high above her head and lashed tightly to the post with thick leather cords that had cut deep into her wrists. Blood had frozen in dark streaks down her forearms. Her cloak was torn and filthy, barely covering her shivering frame. Her legs trembled violently, knees buckling every few seconds as she fought to stay upright. Someone had left her here like a warning, like meat for the crows. I stood there for what felt like a long minute, knife already in my hand, though I didn't remember drawing it. Every story I'd ever heard about orcs screamed at me to turn around and walk away. They were raiders, monsters, killers. But this one looked like she was about to die. She lifted her head slowly. Yellow eyes, dull with exhaustion and pain, met mine. There was no rage in them, only a tired, hollow resignation. I swallowed hard and stepped closer, moving slow so she could see I wasn't rushing her. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said, my voice rough from the cold. She didn't answer, just watched me with those tired eyes as I approached the post. The leather cords were cruelly tight. I slid the knife carefully under the first binding on her left wrist and began to cut. The moment the cord snapped, her arm dropped heavily. She swayed dangerously. I caught her around the waist before she could collapse completely. Gods! She was lighter than she should have been, all muscle and bone and freezing skin. Her head lolled against my shoulder. She was burning with fever despite the freezing wind. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. I didn't think. I simply wrapped my own cloak around her as best I could, lifted her into my arms, and started the long, difficult walk back toward the house. The wind fought me every step of the way, but I kept going, one foot in front of the other, the orc girl's faint breath brushing against my neck. By the time I kicked open the door of my small wooden house, my arms were shaking. I laid her down on my own bed, the only real bed in the place, and immediately went to work. I built up the fire until the flames roared in the hearth. I heated water, cleaned the deep gashes on her wrists with what little medicinal spirits I had, and bandaged them with the cleanest strips of cloth I could find. She drifted in and out of consciousness while I worked. Every time her eyes opened, they were full of suspicion and fear. Night had fully fallen by the time I finished. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the fire cast warm, flickering light across the rough wooden walls. I sat on the stool beside the bed, exhausted. Her eyes opened again. This time they stayed open. She tried to push herself up, but the pain made her hiss between her teeth. She curled inward, instinctively trying to hide her bandaged wrists. Her voice came out hoarse and cracked. "What do you want from me?" I stayed where I was, giving her space. "Nothing," I answered quietly. She stared at me for a long time, like she was waiting for the lie to reveal itself. "I don't take what isn't mine," I added, "and you don't belong to anyone." She didn't reply. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the crackling of the fire. I poured a cup of the herbal tea I'd brewed and set it on the small table near the bed. "What's your name?" I asked gently. She remained silent. Something in her expression told me the question hurt more than her wounds. I nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. "If you don't want to tell me your old name," I said, "then I'll call you Yara for now." Her brow furrowed slightly. "In the old speech of this valley, Yara means the green shoot that grows again after the fire has passed." She looked down at her bandaged wrists, then back at me. After a long moment, she whispered the name like she was testing it. "Yara." It sounded like the first real breath she had taken in a very long time. That night, she slept by the fire on a thick pile of blankets I had laid out. I sat in the old wooden chair across from her, feeding the flames every so often so they wouldn't die. Outside, the wind still screamed across the valley, tearing at the broken fence where I had found her. But inside my small, poor house, for the first time in many years, there was another living soul who needed me to stay awake and keep the light burning. And for the first time in many years, I didn't feel quite so alone. The next morning, the storm had eased into a thin, cold drizzle that pattered against the roof. I rose early and stirred a thin soup over the fire. Roots, a scrap of dried meat, and just enough salt to make it taste like something. When I heard the rustle of blankets from the bed, I turned. Yara was trying to push herself upright. Pain flashed across her face the moment she moved her bandaged wrists. She clenched her jaw and gripped the edge of the blanket instead. I ladled soup into a wooden bowl and carried it over, stopping a respectful distance away. "Here," I said quietly. "It's warm." She looked at the bowl, then at me. Her yellow eyes were wary, measuring every move I made. Before she reached for it, she asked in a voice still raw from the cold and fever, "What do I have to do to repay you?" I set the bowl on the small table beside the bed and stepped back. "Live first," I answered. "We can worry about the rest later." She studied me for a long moment, searching for the lie. Finally, she picked up the bowl with both bandaged hands and began to eat, slowly, carefully. For the next several days, Yara remained deeply guarded. Every time I stepped too close, her body would tense. When I brought her medicine, she would sniff it first before drinking. When I left the room to tend the goats or check the fields, I could feel her eyes following me until the door closed. I did not blame her. Someone who had been left tied to a fence like an animal had every reason not to trust the world or the man who had cut her down from it. On the third morning, I decided it was time to give her something more permanent than the corner by the fire. I spent the morning cleaning out the small room that had once belonged to my mother. I moved in a sturdy wooden bed, laid down the thickest wool blanket I owned, placed a basin of fresh water on a stand, and fixed a solid bolt on the inside of the door so it could be locked from within. When everything was ready, I showed her the room. "From today," I said, "this is your room." Yara stood in the doorway and looked at the simple space for a long time. Her gaze lingered on the bolt. "I can lock the door?" she asked, almost disbelieving. "If the person inside is you," I answered, "then the key should belong to you." Something small but profound shifted in her face. She stepped inside and ran her fingers lightly over the wooden door. She did not thank me with words, but the way she closed the door behind her that night told me enough. As her wrists healed, she began to speak in fragments. She told me she had once belonged to a wandering band of orcs captured and forced into hard labor for a border lord. When she resisted the cruel overseer of the labor camp, they beat her and dragged her to my fence as an example, leaving her there to die in the wind and cold so that no one else would dare run away. She never spoke her old name. I never asked. When she grew strong enough to move around the farm, she insisted on helping. I gave her only light tasks at first, gathering eggs, hanging herbs to dry, tending the fire, feeding the goats, but she worked as if her life depended on never stopping, pushing herself far harder than necessary, as though any moment of rest might mean I would send her away. One afternoon, I found her trying to carry a heavy bundle of firewood despite her still healing wrists. I took the wood from her gently. "Yara," I said, "this isn't a labor camp. If you're tired, you rest." She looked at me as if I had spoken words from another world. Still, she learned with surprising speed. Within a week, she knew which goat liked to break through the fence, which sections of the barley field still had life in them, where the roof leaked worst, and which wild leaves could ease a fever in the animals. The house slowly began to change under her hands. The hearth stayed cleaner, the firewood was stacked more neatly, small tears in the blankets were carefully mended. Even the drafty window received a new piece of heavy cloth to keep out the biting wind. One quiet evening after supper, I placed a small gift on the table between us. It was a simple leather cord with a small piece of bone I had carved myself, a tiny sprouting plant, the symbol of new life after fire had passed. I slid it toward her. "It's not a chain," I said softly. "It's not a mark of ownership. It's only a charm for peace and safety." Yara stared at the pendant for a very long time without touching it. Then she reached out, picked it up, and turned it slowly in her fingers. Her eyes grew wet, but she did not turn away. She slipped the cord over her head and let the small bone carving rest against her collarbone. "No one has ever given me anything without wanting something back," she whispered, her voice thick. That night, for the first time since she had come to my house, Yara went to sleep without sliding the bolt on her door. I did not enter her room. I did not call out to her. I simply sat by the fire as I always did, feeding the flames so they would burn steadily through the long, dark hours. And as the light danced across the walls, I understood something important. Saving someone was not only about cutting the ropes that had bound them. It was about giving them the quiet confidence that no new ropes would ever be placed around their neck again. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the valley. The biting winds from Carvorn grew less cruel, and patches of green began pushing through the frozen earth. Yara grew stronger with each passing day. The deep cuts on her wrists healed into thin silver scars, and the fever that had burned in her finally broke. She no longer spent her mornings huddled by the fire. Instead, she stepped outside with me each dawn, pulling on the spare wool tunic I had given her and walking the fields as though the land itself now belonged to her as much as it did to me. We worked side by side in silence that felt comfortable rather than empty. She helped me haul stones from the barley field so the soil could breathe. She mended gaps in the fence with steady, practiced hands. She learned which herbs grew best in the thin soil behind the house and coaxed the goats into better grazing patterns. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice carried a quiet steadiness I had not heard before. Her shoulders no longer curved inward. She walked with her head high, the small bone pendant I had carved for her resting against her collarbone like a promise she had finally decided to keep. One clear afternoon, when the sun had warmed the hill behind the farm, I took her there. The climb was gentle, but the view from the crest was wide enough to see the whole valley, the small wooden house, the patchwork barley field, the crooked fence line, and the silver thread of the stream cutting through the grass. I knelt, gathered a handful of cold ash from a small fire I had built earlier, and traced her name across a flat stone slab in careful letters. "Yara, this is your mark on this land," I told her. "No one can take it away." She stared at the ash letters for a long time. The wind tugged at her dark hair. "What if the wind blows it away?" she asked quietly. "Then the wind will carry your name across the whole valley so everyone knows you are here." She did not smile, but something in her eyes softened. We sat on the hill in silence while the sun dipped lower. That was the day she finally told me the rest of her story. She had been sold to the labor camp when she was barely more than a child. The border lord needed strong backs to quarry stone for his walls. She spent years in the dust and darkness, dragging sledges until her hands bled and her back ached constantly. 3 times she tried to run. The first 2 times they caught her quickly and beat her. The 3rd time she almost made it. They dragged her back, tied her to my fence like a broken tool, and left her there to die in the cold so the others would see what happened to anyone who dared to dream of freedom. "I thought that was the end," she said, looking out over the valley. "I thought the wind would finish what they started." I listened without interrupting. When she finished, the only thing I could say was simple and true. "But you didn't die." She turned her head and met my eyes. "No," she whispered. "You found me." The nights changed after that. For weeks she had woken gasping from nightmares, her breathing sharp and frightened. I would sit by the fire in the main room, close enough to hear but never entering her space, ready if she needed someone near. One night, the nightmares simply stopped. She slept until morning light slipped through the window. When she woke, she found me still sitting in the chair, eyes heavy but open. "You stayed there the whole night?" she asked. "I kept the fire going," I answered, "in case you needed it." She looked at me for a long moment, then said softly, "No one has ever stayed through the night just so I could sleep." After that, a gentle closeness settled between us. We did not touch. We did not need to. It was enough to sit on opposite sides of the hearth, sharing the quiet warmth, knowing the other was there. Then came the day I went down to the village market to sell a few eggs and a bundle of dried herbs. While I was haggling with the old woman at the stall, one of the hired swords who sometimes worked for the border lords stepped close and asked in a low voice if I had seen the orc girl who ran from the northern camp. He said Lord Dargan Vale had posted a generous reward for her return. Dead or alive, I kept my face blank, shook my head, and finished my business as quickly as I could. But the cold that settled in my chest did not leave me on the long walk home. That evening, I told Yara everything. I did not soften the words. She stood perfectly still while I spoke, the color draining from her green face until she looked almost gray. When I finished, she turned away, walked to her room, and began gathering the few things she owned into a small bundle. "I have to go," she said, voice tight. "If I stay, they will come for you too. They will burn this place. They will—" I stayed by the door, giving her space, not blocking her way. "If you leave because you want to be free," I said quietly, "I will help you pack and point you toward the safest path through the hills." I took a slow breath. "But if you leave because you are afraid, then let me be afraid with you." She froze with the bundle half packed in her hands. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then very slowly, she set the bundle down on the floor. She looked at me across the small room, yellow eyes bright with something I had never seen in them before, choice. "I don't want to run anymore," she said. That night, we began preparing. We reinforced the gate with thicker timber. We cleared a hidden trail through the woods behind the house in case we needed to disappear quickly. I checked the old bow and the few arrows I owned. Yara sharpened the tools we already used every day until they could cut more than just rope. We packed small bags of dried food and filled water skins. We did not speak of fighting. We spoke of standing, together. When everything that could be done was done, Yara sat beside me by the fire. She reached out and laid her hand close to mine on the hearthstone, not touching, but near enough that I could feel the warmth of her skin. She closed her fingers around the small bone pendant at her throat. "If they call me by my old name," she said, "I will not turn my head." I nodded. She looked straight into the flames, voice steady and low like a vow spoken to the fire itself. "My name is Yara." And for the first time since the wind had carried her broken voice to me across the frozen fields, I believe she truly meant it. The morning arrived still and cold, the kind of quiet that often comes before trouble. I was out by the northern fence, patching a broken rail with old rope, when I heard the sound of hooves, multiple horses moving fast. My stomach tightened. 5 riders crested the low rise and approached the farm at a trot. They wore dark leather armor and carried swords at their hips. The emblem of Lord Dargan Vale was stitched onto their shoulders. Hired blades, they reined in their horses just outside my gate. The leader, a hard-faced man with a scar across his jaw, looked me up and down. "You the owner here?" he asked. "I am," I answered, gripping the handle of my axe a little tighter. "We're looking for a female orc. Escaped from the labor camp up north, green skin, black hair, about this tall." He raised a hand to indicate height. "Lord Dargan has a heavy bounty on her head. Alive is better, but dead pays just fine, too." Before I could answer, the front door of the house opened. Yara stepped out into the pale morning light. She wore the simple wool tunic and trousers I had given her. Her black hair was neatly braided. The small bone pendant I carved for her rested against her chest. She walked forward with steady steps and stopped beside me, shoulder to shoulder. She did not hide behind me, The leader's eyes narrowed the moment he saw her. "That's her," one of the men growled. "That's the runaway." The leader leaned forward in his saddle. "You're coming back with us, girl. Lord Dargan doesn't like losing his property." Yara lifted her chin. Her voice was calm, but carried clearly across the yard. "I am not property." The man laughed. "You've got some fire left in you, good. Makes the hunt more interesting." He called her by the old name she had never spoken in my house, the name that had died on that frozen fence. Yara closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, steady and clear. "That name died, tied to a post in the wind," she said. "My name is Yara." The leader smirked. "A name given by some dirt-poor farmer doesn't mean anything." "It means I am still alive," she replied without hesitation, "and I choose to stay alive here." I stepped slightly forward, positioning myself between her and the riders. "If you have a legal order from the Valley Council, show it," I said. "Otherwise, she is a free worker on my land." I pulled out the document the village scribe had written and signed for me days earlier, stating that Yara worked willingly on my farm. I held it up so they could see the seal. The leader spat on the ground. "A scrap of paper from a farmer and a scribe won't stop Lord Dargan's claim." One of the younger riders dismounted and moved aggressively toward Yara, reaching out to grab her arm. Yara moved faster than I expected. She twisted away and swung the wooden handle of the hoe she had been carrying earlier, striking the man hard across the wrist. He cursed and staggered back, clutching his arm. She planted her feet and stood tall, the hoe held firmly in both hands. "I was once tied and left to die because I was afraid," she said, her voice ringing with quiet strength. "If you want to tie me again today, you will have to listen to me speak first." The yard fell silent. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift in the air. At that moment, I saw movement on the path leading from the village. Several figures were hurrying toward us. The old scribe, the blacksmith, the herb woman, and 2 farmers whose sick goats Yara had helped treat. They had seen the riders and come without being asked. They did not cheer or shout. They simply stood behind us watching. Not everyone loved orcs, but they had seen Yara work, seen her quiet kindness, and they chose to stand there. The leader glanced at the growing number of villagers and cursed under his breath. They had no official warrant, only a bounty poster. Taking Yara by force now would make them kidnappers in front of witnesses. He glared at her one last time. "Lord Dargan will not forget this," he warned. Yara met his eyes without flinching. "Neither will I," she said, "but I no longer belong to him." The riders turned their horses and rode away, dust rising behind them. The moment they disappeared over the rise, Yara's shoulders sagged. Her knees buckled. I caught her before she could fall, wrapping one arm around her waist to steady her. She leaned heavily against me, breathing hard, her whole body trembling with the aftershock of what she had just done. She did not cry loudly. She simply pressed her forehead against my shoulder, eyes closed, taking shaky breaths. "You stood for yourself today," I said softly. She stayed there for a long moment before whispering, almost too quiet to hear, "No. Today, I stood." I held her gently, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against my chest. In that moment, something inside me became perfectly clear. I no longer only wanted to protect her. I wanted to walk beside her, wherever she chose to go. The news of what happened spread quickly through Black Wind Valley. Within days, people were talking about the orc girl who had stood up to Lord Dargan's hired blades and sent them away empty-handed. Some were afraid, some were impressed, and some, quietly and without fanfare, began to show their support. A farmer's wife brought a basket of early spring vegetables. An old shepherd left a young goat at our gate with a note saying it was for the girl who mended fences. The herb woman came with dried leaves and salves, saying Yara might need them. No one said much. They simply left their small gifts and walked away. Slowly our farm began to change. Yara no longer worked only as a helper. She took charge of the vegetable garden, carefully tending every row. She knew which herbs could ease pain in both animals and people. She treated sick goats with mixtures she made herself and taught me how to read the weather in the way the wind moved through the grass. I built her a small shed beside the house where she could keep her drying herbs and simple medicines. Before long, people from the poorer edges of the valley started coming to our door, not just for animals, but for themselves. a mother with a coughing child, an old man with aching joints, a young widow who had lost her husband to the border wars. Yara helped them all with the same quiet patience she had once needed so desperately. She gave them warm water, a place by the fire, and time to speak when they were ready. She asked few questions and made no demands. One evening, as the first signs of true spring touched the valley, I sat with her on the old bench outside the house. The air smelled of damp earth and new growth. "Do you ever want to leave?" I asked. "Go somewhere safer, farther away from Lord Dargan's reach?" Yara looked at the small wooden house, the repaired fence, the garden we had planted together, and then at me. "This is the first place I have ever lived where I did not feel owned," she said softly. "I don't want to leave." I nodded, feeling something warm settle deep in my chest. "Because this land doesn't own anyone," I replied. "It only holds those who choose to stay." She turned to me, and for the first time her smile was peaceful, without shadows. A few nights later we sat together beside the very section of fence where I had found her months ago. The post had been replaced, the ropes long gone. The wind was gentle now. I spoke without pretty words because I had none. "That day, I found you," I said. "I thought I was saving a stranger. But you saved this farm from becoming a silent, empty place. You saved me from a life that had grown too quiet and too cold." Yara looked down at her hands, then back at me. "And I saved you from loneliness?" she asked. "Yes," I admitted with a small smile. "That too." She reached out and placed her hand over mine. There was no trembling this time. Her touch was warm and sure. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I owe you, but because I choose you." We did not rush into anything grand. Yara wanted a simple ceremony first, a naming ritual of her own choosing. On a clear morning, we climbed the hill behind the farm once more. I built a small fire. Yara brought the old worn leather cords that had once bound her wrists, the last pieces she had kept from that terrible day. She burned them in the flames. Then, using the cooled ash, she wrote her name Yara on the same flat stone where I had written it before. This time she wrote it herself, with steady hands. "I will not erase my past," she said, watching the ash settle. "But I will bury what tried to kill me, so something new can grow." I stood beside her in silence, bearing witness. This was her rebirth, and it was not mine to speak over. A few months later, on a mild spring day, we held a quiet wedding in front of the house. There was no gold, no fine clothes, no grand feast. Only the people who mattered, the old scribe, the blacksmith, the herb woman, a few farmers whose lives Yara had quietly touched, and the animals grazing peacefully nearby. I stood before her and spoke from the heart. "I swear I will never treat love as ownership." Yara looked into my eyes and answered with a voice full of hard-won strength. "And I swear I will never let fear choose my path again." When we joined hands, something in the old farm seemed to breathe easier, as if the land itself approved. In time, our small farm became known as Hearthsprout, the place where green shoots grew again after fire. Anyone who had been cast out, abandoned, or broken could come to our gate. Not everyone stayed, but everyone who arrived received the same things Yara had once needed: a bowl of warm soup, a place by the fire, clean water, and the right to keep their own name. Yara began teaching the village children how to read and write in the evenings. I taught wandering folk how to mend fences, care for animals, and plant crops that could survive hard soil. The house that had once felt too empty slowly filled with voices, laughter, and the sounds of life being rebuilt. Sometimes, late at night, I would look at Yara sleeping peacefully beside me and remember the freezing day I had found her tied to that post, bleeding, shivering, and almost without hope. I had given her a name and a place to live. She had given this land its soul. I had cut her free from ropes. She had freed me from a silent, lonely life. And together, on this poor patch of earth, we learned the most important truth of all. Even those who have been abandoned can put down roots. Even those who were once tied can stand tall. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness, a knife cutting through rope, a name freely given, a door left unlocked, is enough to begin rebuilding an entire world.